I was 13, and I'll backtrack a little bit, if you don't mind, to when I first heard there was going to be a new church. We had been parishioners at the cathedral in Boston, and I was in Sunday school there under Father Kukuzis and then Father Zanetos. And one day when I was about 12 or 13, my father came home and he said that several of their friends, the male half of the couples, were talking about forming a new church in Newton Lower Falls. And Lee Loomis, who was one of that handful of men, had his television store in Newton Lower Falls and had heard of a village church that was for sale. So,
Was that his store that was next to the church?
yes.
Because I do remember seeing, I went to the Newton Historical Society where I saw old photographs.
Yes.
And there was a television store.
It was, and he eventually moved it out to
Yeah.
Needham Street.
Okay.
But at that time he was there, and I think that's how they first heard that the church was for sale. And they, I'm going to look at my notes
Absolutely.
here, were, as I recall, my father mentioning Angelo Bassett, Dimitri Decaneus, Lee Loomis, John Athens,
Yeah,
and others.
we do have all these names, yes.
Yes, so then that handful grew to about 19, and my dad, who was a Dr. George Speare, was one of those original 19. And in fact, we have a medal that was given to him posthumously at the 40th anniversary. But I was 13, Cynthia was in her 20s, so my dad, when they eventually bought the church and it began, he made us charter founders. And by that, he, pledged that we would become members of the church, and there was some sort of a financial component.
That was
but
a
that's
great
how
gesture on his part.
It was.
Yeah,
So
for you at that age.
are charter founders at
Yes.
age 13.
Yes.
And the church, as I recall, would you like me to describe it a little bit?
Absolutely. I do know one detail.
Yes.
It had no middle aisle.
No, it didn't.
So that's why we have two at least that I know of who got married not there but in the cathedral because there was no middle aisle. Okay.
The sanctuary, well, first of all,
Yes.
it was a little village church with a spire, the
Yes.
type you would see a couple of centuries ago. There was one room
It was
for
the
the sanctuary.
Newton Wesley Methodist Church at the time.
Okay.
Yes.
See, I didn't remember what
Yes.
it had been before. There was one room, and there were pews on three sides of a square, and the fourth side was the altar, and behind the last row was the candle stand, and that was the sanctuary. Then there was some very steep steps leading down to a basement that was finished, a very large room with a stage at one end, where all the coffee hours, meetings, events would be held in the early days. And then you'd walk out to a little driveway parking lot, and behind the parking lot was a large white house that I think must have been the parish house originally. And in that house is where various events would take place. And one of them was Sunday school. So I was in the first Sunday school, and we were like 13 to 16 years old.
Do you
So
remember the name of the teacher? Any of the teachers' names?
I can tell you that it was a theologian who came from Holy Cross
Cross.
to teach us, because by that age we were more serious in our
Yes.
Sunday school studies. I was a member of the first Goya, and in those days the parents were in charge of the Goya. And they would do things, I remember, craft evenings. I remember down in that basement area putting on various skits that had to do with the Bible or reading in Greek or even doing some Greek dancing in those days. And I did want to mention some of those early Goyans, because you know, Professor, that many of these people are still parishioners today,
Correct.
which is
Yes.
quite remarkable to
Fascinating.
me. So the ones I remember were Cindy and Joanne Tremas, and Cindy Tremas is now Stanton. She married
Yes.
Bill Stanton, who was another Goyan. Thalia Pananides, Elaine Panagopoulos, now Elaine
Elaine.
Ward, who has
Yes.
been on the parish council, Athena Stavropoulos, now Athena Pappas, very active for years in the church, her husband's still in the choir, Nikki Dadiskus, now Stornaras,
yes.
who is Miss Philoptoros here,
Yes.
as I call her.
She still is in charge. Yes.
Greg and Stevie Loomis, Stefan and Peter Bassett, and of course Peter Bassett is responsible for this lovely new church that we have for the building of it. Tony and John Decaneus, Jimmy Kritzis, and Donna Harris. We also founded a Greek school, and it did
Yes.
not take place here in the church. It took place about 3 blocks away at the home of Angelo and Aliki Bassett. We would meet in the dining room, and there was a student at BU from Greece a woman who would come out to be our teacher. I did not get married in this church. I got married in the cathedral, which was my first church,
Right.
and my grandfather, Arthur Stavropoulos, had been very active in the cathedral. He had laid one of the cornerstones, and in 1920 he was one of the early presidents. And my husband's parents, Bill and Virginia Triant, had been married in the cathedral, so we had a lot.
Yes.
So we were married in the cathedral, but then when we had our children, both were christened in this church, one by Father Gallos, one
Yes.
by Father Manicus. Bill was an altar boy here. One of our grandchildren has been christened here, and a son and daughter-in-law married by Father Cremidas, and funerals taken place, etc. I'm going to hark back to that original village church first, because I was concentrating on that, my memories. There are several events I remember there. One was the naming of the church.
Yes.
That took place in the downstairs parish hall, set up like an auditorium, and on the stage were Father Bluhuros and a moderator. I don't remember who he was. I was 13 in the audience. But the way the church was named, there was bidding. You could suggest any name you wanted, but you had to bring up either a check or a pledge with that naming.
Nobody cheated, right?
I hope not. So there were many, many names at first, and eventually they were whittled down to 2, Saint Sophia and Saint Demetrius. And I'm pretty sure that it was Harry Angelus, the father of Mary Philopoulos, who sat on Saint Sophia. And then there were several Jimmies who were sat on Saint Demetrius. The one I knew best was Jimmy Salas, but I think there were several others. And at the end, the bidding became quite spirited, and one would go up, and just as it was going to be named, the other would whip up. So you know the outcome of that story. Yes. 2 sad events. The first funeral I ever attended was of George Samelis, a young parishioner, the husband of Tuli Samelis. I was 16 at the time. And also, there was the death of a baby, the Atzelis baby. And what we did after worship, we went out to the right-hand side of the driveway where there was a lawn, and we planted a tree in memory of that baby. Then we started expanding and growing large, and I do remember we were going to have a Glendy, but there was not room anymore for a dance in the parish hall. So we went to Norumbega Park, to a function room overlooking the river where the Marriott Hotel is now, and had our Glendy there. And then I remember, and this brings us to the new church, the buying of land in Newton on the intersection of Route 16 and 128.
Correct.
And that land we must have owned for a couple of years, I'm thinking. And then I heard that there was another group that had found land in Weston that might be more suitable.
So I remember that this was never used, that first.
How this church came about. And I've served on a lot of Philoptochos committees in this church, but 2 things I remember in particular. One was we had this enormous Greek festival called Megafest. And thousands of people came. We had to have parking over at Weston High School and everything. But what I remember is sitting in the kitchen and buttering layer after layer of phyllo dough for the
Absolutely.
baklava.
That's the way to do it.
And another time we had a Christmas festival with different tables set up, selling and offering different items. And I was put in charge of the candy table. So Presbytera Effie Manicus
Effie,
said
yes.
to me, I know of a wholesale candy store in Natick, and the two of us went out there, and we were like little kids in Charlie's Chocolate Factory, tasting all the candy canes and the ribbon candy. So we did. We brought the candy back and set that up. I feel very fortunate to have worshipped under all the priests whose names I mentioned, and especially Father Cremidas today. And it's also been a very warm and comforting and a spiritually uplifting experience to have been a member of this wonderful parish for 60 years.